It was supposed to be just another day. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the city as Charles Whitmore walked down the quiet sidewalk. His steps were slow but purposeful, the early morning air crisp against his skin. Dressed in an old flannel shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed work boots, he looked like any other retired man out for a morning stroll. But today was different. Today, he was on a mission, one that would change everything. For years, Charles had been fascinated by luxury cars, not because he needed one, but because of what they represented: success, freedom, a lifetime of hard work paying off. As a young man, he had struggled, working multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. He knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be treated as if he didn't belong, and that feeling had never left him. Even now, when he had more money than he could ever spend, the sleek dealership loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the city's skyline. He had passed by this place countless times, always admiring the cars from a distance. But today, he would walk inside. Today, he would finally buy the car he had dreamed of for years. As he stepped through the glass doors, the scent of leather and polished metal filled his senses. The showroom was immaculate, a temple of luxury, with gleaming sports cars lined up like jewels on display. Charles took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He had earned this. But before he could take another step, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" Charles turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed salesman eyeing him with thinly veiled suspicion. The man's name tag read Richard. His suit was pressed to perfection, his smile practiced and professional, but his eyes told a different story, one of quiet condescension. Charles smiled. "Yes, I'd like to take a closer look at that model over there." He gestured toward a sleek red sports car, its curves as perfect as a piece of modern art. Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking over Charles's worn clothes. "Sir, these cars are quite expensive." Charles chuckled. "I imagine they are." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps I can direct you to something more a broken bar practical." Charles raised an eyebrow. "I know exactly what I want." The air between them grew tense. A few feet away, another salesman, a younger man, watched the exchange, looking uneasy. Richard sighed, glancing at his watch. "Sir, this dealership caters to a certain broken bar clientele. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at a different dealership?" Charles felt a flicker of something deep in his chest. Not anger, not yet, just the familiar sting of being dismissed. It was a feeling he had known all his life, from the days when he had to beg for work to the years spent proving himself in a world that didn't believe in him. "So, you're saying I can't even look?" Charles asked, his voice calm. Richard gave him a tight smile. "I just don't want to waste your time, sir." A woman nearby, draped in designer clothing, smirked as she watched. A businessman in a tailored suit chuckled under his breath. The air was thick with quiet judgment. Charles nodded slowly. "All right, I'll be back." Richard smirked. "Sure you will." Charles turned and walked out, but not before catching the look on the younger salesman's face, a flicker of recognition, maybe even respect. As the glass door swung shut behind him, Charles pulled out his phone. He had a call to make. Inside the dealership, Richard was laughing with a co-worker. "Did you see that guy?" he scoffed. "Thought he could just waltz in here and buy a sports car." The co-worker chuckled. "Some people don't know their place." The younger salesman, the one who had been watching, clenched his jaw. He knew exactly who Charles Whitmore was. He had read about him in business magazines, had seen interviews about his rise from nothing to one of the wealthiest self-made men in the country. And now, they had just insulted him. Minutes later, the sound of high-end engines rumbled outside. The glass door swung open, and the entire dealership fell silent. Charles was back, but this time, he wasn't alone. A convoy of luxury SUVs pulled up in front of the dealership, their tinted windows hiding their prestigious passengers. When the doors opened, a group of sharply dressed men and women stepped out as his personal assistants, financial advisors, and legal team. At the front, Charles stepped forward, still dressed in the same flannel shirt and worn boots, but now carrying a sleek leather briefcase. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Richard's face drained of color as he realized his mistake. The manager, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, rushed over, his expression one of barely contained panic. Mr. Whitmore, I had no idea you were visiting today. His voice was too loud, too eager. Welcome. Please, allow me to personally assist you. Charles said nothing at first. He simply walked up to Richard, his expression calm but unreadable. Then, he placed the briefcase on the counter and flipped it open. Inside, stacks of neatly bundled cash gleamed under the showroom lights. I'll take the car, Charles said, his voice steady. In cash, right now. A stunned silence fell over the dealership. Every employee, every customer, turned to watch. Richard stammered, "You have broken bar, sir. I didn't realize." Charles looked at the younger salesman. "You," he said. "You seemed like the only one here who had some sense. You'll handle my sale." The young salesman's eyes widened. "Of course, sir, right this way." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the dealership manager silenced him with a glare. "You are fired." Richard paled. "Wait, sir, please." The manager didn't even look at him. He turned to Charles instead. "Mr. Whitmore, please, let's make this right." Charles considered for a moment, then nodded. "Good. But I won't be buying just one car. I'll take 3. Gasps filled the room. Even the other customers stared in disbelief. As Charles followed the young salesman toward the finance office, he glanced back at Richard, who was now standing frozen, his career in shambles. It was a lesson he'd never forget, and never judge a book by its cover, because the man you dismiss today may be the one who owns the dealership tomorrow. Charles watched as the young salesman led him toward the private lounge area of the dealership, his confidence unwavering. The hush that had fallen over the showroom was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the laughter and smug glances from minutes ago. Now, all eyes were on him, and not because of his worn clothes, but because of the power he wielded. The manager scrambled ahead, pulling out a chair for Charles as if he were royalty. "Please, Mr. Whitmore, make yourself comfortable. Would you like something to drink? Water? Coffee? Perhaps something else?" Charles waved a hand dismissively. "I'm here for business, not hospitality." The young salesman, still stunned that he was chosen to handle the sale, nodded quickly and pulled out a tablet. "Mr. Whitmore, we have several high-performance models in stock. If you'd like, I can show you a customized selection that fits your needs." Charles leaned back, glancing toward the glass wall separating the lounge from the main showroom. Richard was still standing there, frozen, his face pale as the weight of his mistake fully settled on him. Other employees whispered behind the counters, some shaking their heads, others sneaking glances in Charles's direction with newfound respect. "I want 3 vehicles," Charles said, bringing his attention back to the salesman. "One for myself, one for my business partner, and one for a special delivery." The salesman nodded, his hands moving swiftly across the tablet screen. "We have the latest models in stock, including our limited edition luxury series. If you'd like, I can arrange for a test drive immediately." Charles smirked. "I don't need a test drive. I know exactly what I'm buying." He turned to the manager, his expression unreadable. "But first, I have some conditions." The manager gulped. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore, anything." Charles tapped a finger against the table. "First, I want this young man to receive the highest commission possible for handling my purchase. He's the only one here who treated me with respect." The young salesman's eyes widened. "Sir, that's it." "No need to thank me," Charles interrupted. "You earned it." The manager nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. Consider it done." Charles's gaze darkened. "Second, I want Richard to personally deliver one of the cars to my estate." "Himself?" The manager hesitated, stealing a glance at Richard, who was still visibly shaken. "You have broken bar, Mr. Whitmore. We typically have our specialized drivers handle deliveries." "Not this time," Charles said, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for negotiation. "Richard looked down on me the moment I walked in. He needs to learn the value of humility. If he refuses, fire him." Richard visibly flinched at those words, his pride and livelihood hanging by a thread. The manager, trapped between customer satisfaction and employee loyalty, had no choice. He nodded. "Yes, sir. Richard will personally deliver the vehicle." Charles smirked. "Good. Now, let's finalize the paperwork." The sale went through smoothly. As the documents were signed, the dealership's staff rushed to process the transaction, ensuring everything was prepared to Charles's exact specifications. Meanwhile, Richard sat in silence, dread settling deep in his bones. He had mocked the wrong man. Several hours later, after the dealership had completed every last detail, Charles stood outside as the vehicles were prepared for transport. 2 of them were driven away to his estate, handled by professional drivers. The third, an elegant, limited edition luxury sedan, was waiting for Richard to take the wheel. Richard stood next to the vehicle, his hands clammy as he held the keys. He had gone from being the top salesman in the dealership to a glorified delivery driver in less than a day. "Don't scratch the paint," Charles said with a smirk as he climbed into his own car, the young salesman shaking his hand one last time before he left. As the convoy of luxury vehicles rolled out of the dealership, Richard was left standing there, his face burning with humiliation. The other employees who had laughed with him earlier now avoided his gaze. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was ruined. But the lesson was far from over. The drive to Charles's estate was long and silent. Richard gripped the steering wheel, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had spent years building his reputation in the industry, carefully curating an image of exclusivity and prestige. And yet, in a matter of hours, his arrogance had cost him everything. As he approached the grand entrance of the Whitmore estate, his breath caught in his throat. The mansion was breathtaking, an architectural masterpiece surrounded by acres of lush green land. Security personnel guided him toward the private garage, where he saw the other 2 cars already parked. Charles was waiting. Richard stepped out of the vehicle, hesitating before handing the keys over. "Sir, Charles held up a hand, silencing him. "Tell me something, Richard. What did you see when I walked into that dealership today?" Richard swallowed hard. "A broken bar. I saw a man who didn't look like he belonged." Charles nodded. "And yet, I belonged more than anyone in that room." Richard lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I made a mistake." Charles studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "No, Richard, you made a choice." Silence stretched between them. "I built everything I have from nothing," Charles continued. "I've met men like you before, people who judge worth based on appearances, who decide someone's value by the clothes they wear. But life doesn't work that way." Richard clenched his jaw. "I understand now." Charles smirked. "Do you?" He gestured toward the luxury car. "Because here's the final part of your lesson." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" Charles tossed him a folder. Richard opened it, his eyes widening in shock as he read the contents. "You a broken bar bought the dealership?" Richard stammered, his hands trembling. Charles nodded. "As of 10 minutes ago, it's under my name. I own everything including your job." Richard's face drained of color. "Sir, please." Charles held up a hand again. "Save it. You're done. Consider this your severance package." He pulled out an envelope and tossed it onto the car's hood. "There's enough in there to help you land on your feet. But don't come back." Richard's hands shook as he picked up the envelope. His pride told him to reject it, but desperation forced him to hold on. Charles sighed. "People like you always think wealth and success come wrapped in a suit and tie. But the real power lies in the hands of those who understand humility, respect, and hard work." "You looked at me and saw nothing." He gestured to the massive estate behind him. "And yet, I was the one who had it all." Richard couldn't argue. He had spent his entire career chasing prestige, but in the end, it had all come crashing down because of his arrogance. Charles turned away, signaling to his staff, "See him out." As Richard walked toward the gates, head bowed, he realized something he had never truly considered before. He had spent his life chasing status, but today, he had learned the true meaning of success, and he had lost everything because he had been too blind to see it. As the gates closed behind him, Charles took one last look before heading inside. He had proven his point, and the lesson, it was one Richard would never forget.